Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. It's an honor to be speaking to you. I see we have almost 200 participants. So this is the second time Saku and I are doing it, and we'll introduce ourselves in a little bit. But I am compelled to start by observing the passing of a true intellectual superhero of mine and many others as well. Andy Van de Ven, I don't know if you know, he passed away a couple of weeks ago. And he has had a profound influence on both Saku and me. We were actually working on a paper together until the very end. And we obviously want to see the completion of that paper. But I just wanted to, I'm saddened, of course, but at the same time, as I look at his legacy of engaged scholarship and everything, and his generosity, there must be dozens of people here today who have been the recipients of Andy's generosity. Saku, is there anything you'd like to say about Andy before we get started?
No, it's just that I just was thinking of him this morning because actually Andy was in the audience the last time Mikko and I.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like 2 months ago, him and Alf Satre, he's his co-author. We had a great conversation during the session. And sort of I had a chance to work with Andy on the paper, but also in the classroom quite a bit in our healthcare leadership program. My co-author Henry Mintzberg and I, our friend, so colleague here in at McGill, sort of Henry and Andy were old friends, and we wrote a little obituary in LinkedIn, just a paragraph of text. And Henry put it very well that they don't make them like that anymore. Yeah. And it was truly a kind of an old school gentleman in the best possible sense, and I just It's really saddening, but also sort of, I think his legacy is something that at least personally I aspire. I make a New Year's resolution every year. I make the same one every year, that sort of do not drink bad wine and try not to be an asshole. And sort of, in the second sense, Andy, he's in kind of his example helps me and inspires me to work a little bit harder on the second one. Anyway.
Excellent. Okay, so just let's do a brief introduction, just very briefly. Saku and I have been partners in crime for 15 years now. And the interesting thing is that we have very different backgrounds, very different kinds of training. We've never worked on an empirical paper together. I doubt we ever will, but we have found a common interest, if not passion, in questions of methodology. So Saku coming from a qualitative background and me from a quantitative, we see that we struggle with the same questions. The answers are often different, but today's conversation, and I hope this will be a conversation, will echo that very strongly, that even though we have quantitative and qualitative research traditions, methods, and methodologies, many of the fundamental questions are almost identical. And as we have argued in multiple articles that we have co-authored, we all use the same tools. We use inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, every single one of us. So there is this kind of sense of commonality, which has been a source of insight. We did, this was in February, we did a webinar, which you can find on YouTube. And there were so many questions that we ended up doing a 2-hour follow-up podcast. So if you have no life, like I don't, here's something you could be watching afterwards. And I think that if you were in that first session, and if you have watched the follow-up podcast in particular, I think that today's conversation is going to make more sense. But let me just very briefly, for the benefit of those who have not watched the first one, just very briefly. Saku and I, we kind of evenly insult everyone, and that when we're pointing out methodological problems, as we do. Finnish people always put candor before politeness. So we look at our methodological conversations, and with the intent of clarifying and helping researchers. There's a lot of talk about reasoning in particular that's confusing, and here are the three observations that we made at the start of the first webinar. I will not go back to them because there's a couple hours of conversation on them already. And then this article by Gundula Bosch, who is, I think, a molecular biologist. This was in Nature in 2018. This idea of training PhD students to be thinkers. When Saku sent this to me about 6 months ago, I read it and I said, there's something really, really important here. The idea of putting philosophy back into the doctorate. So today's conversation is going to be about thinking. It's going to be about reasoning. It's going to be about how you have learned to reason, how you have been taught to reason, and then what kind of guidance, if any, methodological texts could offer us. Okay, so that's the preface for. So before we dive into this, Saku, anything you want to add to this brief intro?
So what we would like to focus on today is really the question of PhD education, and sort of I wrote a paper with Richard Whittington, it was published last year, about how people become strategists. So we looked at this really curious, semi-professional, job description of how you become a strategist. So it's a process of identity work. It's a process of becoming. It's a process of personal growth and change. And now we're going to be looking into the type of activity that's involved in becoming a PhD, and it's not sort of as simple as one might think. So learning scholarship, there are actually sort of many things that actually might be detrimental to becoming a scholar that actually is being taught in PhD programs, and perhaps we can reflect on that a little bit as well, because there's a reason why this thing was published in Nature, and also I was trained in philosophy, so I have a master's in philosophy. And what philosophy means here is not that you know the difference between Kantian and Humean notions of consciousness, for instance. So philosophy is a practice. So it's a way of engaging. It's a way of questioning. And I guess for me, the key thing is the sense of responsibility, the sense of intellectual responsibility that scholars should hold over their work. Mm-hmm. So whatever we say, ultimately, it is us who are responsible for. So it's not about getting published. Of course, it's about getting published if we want to have a career. Not nowadays, there's I don't want to sugarcoat what the world is like, but ultimately, sort of, it's not getting published. What is it that we publish? Sort of, what are the arguments that we make? And it's not just getting past the very high bar of these journals. Mm. But also sort of, making an intellectual contribution. Going back to Andy, it's not that he published so many times in these great journals, but what was it that he said that sort of really resonates with me? Absolutely.
John York is asking, can we get slides for this session? I'm happy to provide PDF versions if you want. Ibrad, I can send these to you. I don't know if there's a way to link. I think we can link them through YouTube as well. Obviously, they will be embedded in the YouTube presentation, but I'm happy to provide the slides as well. So no problem at all. So a fair warning, what follows is not simple. It's not easy. So if you find yourselves taking our names in vain because this is complicated, it's supposed to be complicated. So, and I think that's really important starting point, because I think that this idea of methodological templates, a conversation that's been really going on for the past, I want to say 5 to 7 years. I think that one of the things that feeds this idea of methodological templates is this craving for guidance. And you may, if you're looking for guidance in the next hour and a half, you may find yourself disappointed. We're going to ask a lot of questions, and we're going to invite you to think about these issues in the context of your own research. So with that, let us pose the first question, and let's put this in the context of sample size. Whether we speak of number of cases, number of observations, number of interviews, number of informants, all of us have to address the how many question in one way or another. So I'm a statistician, so I think about sample size in terms of representativeness. I think about it in terms of estimating parameters and so on. And then Saku, as a qualitative researcher, he has to think in terms, okay, how many interviews, how many cases, and so on. So what we would like to do is, why don't you think about this, these three questions, and any comments, any observations, or any follow-up questions that come to mind, please write them in the chat box, and we'll try to pick up some ideas from there. So there's this notion of statistical power. Okay, so this is, I'm going to talk about quantitative research in a little bit, and one of the
theoretical saturation, yeah. So that's an Eisenhower concept, yeah.
Rules of thumb. Rules of thumb is something that we really want to fight tooth and nail. There are really no rules, in the sense that rules of thumb. What are some rules of thumb about? Well, I'm going to talk about rules of thumb in statistical research in a bit. Available resources. So yes, there are practical considerations that are kind of strictly outside of methodological considerations, but there are things that constrain the size of our samples. Let me just briefly, I participated yesterday in a very interesting final defense of a executive doctoral student in Chicago. He is one of the, he's an executive officer in the Chicago Police Department, and he did a multiple case study of police officers who have been involved in fatal shootings. So he examined 10 cases of police officers who have, in the line of duty, taken the life of another human being. And we had a very interesting discussion about sample size and how he was able to secure even 10. I mean, how much do police officers who have taken the life of another human, how openly do they want to talk about these experiences with a researcher? Well, the fact that Sean Joyce, who was a candidate, that he is a cop himself, that helped him establish credibility in the eyes of his informants. I told flat out in the final defense that I would never, ever even consider doing research like that as an outsider. So the fact that he was an insider or native, I think John Van Nanen has used that term. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff on both qualitative and quantitative. And this idea, Ignacio is calling into question this idea of theoretical saturation. Saku, that's probably something you will talk about.
Yeah, well, I picked that up, so that's a good point. And it actually sort of, that's one of those points where truly sort of, methodology and epistemology intersect. Often they actually don't have to, but this is, I would say that our relationship with the question of theoretical saturation, it kind of, I would say that if you endorse that concept, you're endorsing some form of scientific realism in the epistemological sense, and I stress the notion some form.
Okay.
I'll be talking about that a bit later.
Could you very briefly, Saku, make the distinction between methodology and epistemology?
Okay, so of course, in some sense, epistemology is one part methodology is the part of, in some definitions, a part of epistemology, which talks about how we acquire knowledge. So you can, in philosophy, it's sometimes defined that way. Nowadays, methodology often exists in it's a field specific discourse where we talk about the principles of how we gain knowledge in that field, whereas epistemology then is a branch of philosophy which talks about the general criteria about knowledge, whereas then ontology is about our conceptions of what exists. So those are the broad. And when I say that oftentimes actually sort of in multi-paradigmatic fields such as management scholarship, you don't have to actually make epistemological commitments in say things like reasoning. So I think reasoning is pretty free of any epistemological commitment in the basic forms, in induction, deduction, abduction. You have to know how to do them regardless of your epistemology. But then the question of, do you think theoretical saturation is the right way to stop, getting further data? If that's kind of, the decisive factor on when you stop, when you feel that you have the data that you need, that then commits you to the notion that there is one interpretation of what you're trying to figure out. And then that actually is an epistemological commitment. So that is the commitment that sort of, that there are counterpositions to that in epistemology, which would say that it's there are always multiple interpretations of any event or any problem, and then sort of if you endorse that position, that kind of a position, saturation is kind of meaningless, I think. So it's not then. So that's what I mean when I say that this is one of the places, theoretical saturations is one of the issues where methodology and epistemology, they actually intersect, but often sort of they intersect way less than what we think. For instance, so a common misconception is that to do abduction is to commit to, to a constructivist epistemology. So some people argue that, which is kind of ridiculous because abduction was introduced by Charles Sanders Peirce, who was a pragmatist and arguably one type of scientific realist in how he operated. But still, we associate things with these broad categories that it doesn't work. However, theoretical saturation, I would say that's one concept that actually involves, it's a methodological concept that involves an epistemological commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we think of, again, we really want to remain true to research practice. This idea of adding cases until you reach theoretical saturation. Show me an example of a study that did that. All the multiple case studies that come to mind, to me, it seems like the sample size or the number of cases was something that was decided ex ante. It was not something that, hey, once we added the 7th case, we realized that there's saturation and we stopped. If there's an article that actually does that and does it transparently, I'd be really interested in looking at it. But this idea of, while I understand the notion of theoretical saturation, most researchers, whether you're qualitative or quantitative, we tend to make a decision, an a priori ex ante decision about sample size in the beginning, instead of letting it unfold over time. Okay, so let me walk you through a couple of ideas on sample size in the context of quantitative research, and then Saku will do the same for qualitative. Okay, so structural equation you don't need to know what structural equation modeling is. So let me just say that it's a statistical technique where you can have very complex models. You have multiple equations that often need to be solved simultaneously. And this is a question that you could replace that with regression models or any statistical model. In this modeling, in making decisions regarding sample size, what should we do? What are the rules that should be followed, if any? What are the considerations? Well, this is something that's been circling for about 20 years. There's somebody came up with the number 200. I have no idea where it comes from. Let's say it's almost useless. It's useful in the sense that if it said 15, I would set my hair on fire, because 15 is probably, so 200, it has this idea that it can't be really small. So I'm going to say useless, but not completely. Here's another one that takes a little bit more nuanced approach. Well, we ought to look at the model, the structure of the model, and the complexity of the model. And one of the very common ways of operationalizing complexity of a structural cohesion model is to count the number of parameters that you want to estimate. And here is a rule that says that your sample size should be at least 10 times the number of parameters. So if you have a model that has 20 parameters, then 200. But if you have a very complex model that has 50 parameters, then you need at least 500. Okay, I would not endorse either one of these because they really don't take, the first one doesn't take context into account at all. The second one takes context into account, kind of, at least, model complexity, at least incorporate model complexity. I'm going to show you three other, and these are no longer rules, as you can see. These are more questions or challenges to you. What you as a researcher need to do is, among other things, understand the notion of small sample bias and how that might affect your parameter estimates. And some estimators are known to have small sample bias, others not so much. So that's one of the things that you need to consider. Another is, well, what do your variables look like? How are they scaled? Are they interval scaled, ratio? Are they category? Especially the categorical versus continuous. In the world of continuous variables, things are much easier than in the world of variables that are somehow either discrete or have floor and ceiling restrictions and whatnot. And of course, the distribution of your variables. These are things that will eventually have a bearing. And finally, this question, there are situations where you face asymptotic problems, which means that even with an infinite sample size, your estimate is going to be wrong. So seek an understanding of whether and when you may be facing what are called asymptotic problems. And if the problem is asymptotic, as it is in the context of, let's say, the endogeneity problem, omitted variables, increasing sample size ain't going to help you. It's just going to give you a way of getting a more accurate measure of the wrong thing. Well, that's usually not helpful. So things get fairly complicated if you take them seriously. And by the way, and here's a flag I want to plant for you all. I have only talked about the inferential aspect of statistics, the estimation of parameters. I haven't even posed the question, well, what is it that you're interested in? What is the phenomenon of interest? What are you interested in explaining? So once you bring that in, I could talk about this for 5 hours, and I see some of the students here who have taken research methods 3 with me. You know that I'm not lying. I could go on for 3 hours about sample size. Once we incorporate the explanatory aspects, this gets even more complicated. Okay. So Saku, would you like to give a contrast from the point of view of qualitative research in a multiple case study?
Absolutely. So rules of thumb, I guess, are again what we're up against. So I've heard a colleague once, a very esteemed colleague, say that, I tell my PhD students that you should have at least 50 interviews. Once you're 50 interviews, you're about okay. And if you show the next one, then sort of, there are people who believe that a single case study, for instance, isn't any good. That, you have to have points of comparison. There's kind of a logic to both of these. That there's, in particular in the second one, if you subscribe to the Eisenhardt conception of qualitative scholarship, of case scholarship, and if you accept the position of case scholarship as something that lies between, a lot of the the more contextual qualitative stuff and quantitative stuff, if you believe that sort of, qualitative scholarship should take the step towards generalizable propositions like Eisenhardt does, then it makes sense to require this sort of, comparisons that happen across cases, as happens with cases. But sort of both of these are assumptions that really depend on the context. They depend on basically two things. What is it that you're studying, and then how is it that you would like to study? What is the type of study that you're going to publish? So how, what is the type of contribution around that question that you're after? So I always like to think of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the two journalists that uncovered the Watergate scandal. So there's even a movie. What's the name of the movie? Do you remember? With from the 70s, where they basically well, anyway, so there's a movie from the 70s about the Watergate scandal, about these two young journalists somebody who remembers that can put it in the chat.
All the President's Men.
Thank you. So it's a great movie, but sort of, what that is about is that sort of, their careers were on the line, the reputation of the newspaper was on the line. And they had some evidence that the scandal would have happened, that something was afoot. But sort of, well, if you approach a challenge like that, sort of, do you rely on a rule of thumb that I need to interview 50 people and then I'm going to be okay? So if your career really was on the line in that way, and sort of, and you might be actually, your livelihood could have been on the line because you could be sued, and all sorts of bad things would happen if your story didn't hold. Obviously, again, this is an analogy, so it's not exactly the type of situation that we're dealing with when we're doing qualitative research. What we're typically up against is a theoretical contribution, and there isn't a single. We're not explaining a case, we're explaining what the case is a case of, as many people. And Langley, I think, was the first to publish a paper with that on the title. But, it's been thrown around for quite some time, this idea that sort of, what is this a case of? So that's the kind of the journey towards a theoretical contribution. And we often mistake, and what we have to educate junior scholars, often through publication processes, that we get the first submission, and often it's trying to explain the case, but nobody's interested in the case itself, but rather what the case can tell us about theory. So in that sense, so it's not the Watergate scandal. So for them, they were explaining the case, but still, I think the sentiment of where we're trying to get to the bottom of this. And what do we then rely on so what kind of data do we need to make the story stick, or to figure out what actually happened? So then that's deeply contextual. And let me give you an example about interviews. So, why is it that what is an interview a good data source of? So, you compare, say, interviews and documentary sources. You're trying to understand strategic decision-making, for instance, of a company. Do what my colleague Henry Mintzberg has done, and sort of look at, the patterns of strategy formation over time. Is it, if we were to believe principle one, and sort of we'll go do 50 retrospective interviews of people who might not actually remember things pretty, that well, or might have all sorts of political interest in sort of promoting their story of what had happened, or would it actually be better to have a continuous source of, if we get access to, say, the top management team minutes from over time, or do what Henry did? So look at what companies actually, what types of investment decisions did they make, or sort of, what types of, what is their key strategic decision, and what is the output? So let's measure the output, and then let's use some interviews to gain context on why that happened. But sort of, again, or observation. So many people, so I've done a fair amount of research on practice, and I personally sort of started out studying practice with a lot of interviews, and got a very, very fair criticism on my papers that sort of, asking people about their practice is not necessarily the best way to figure out what they're doing. Wouldn't it be sort of much better to go actually watch what they were doing? Again, sort of Henry Mintzberg in his Nature of Managerial Work, his PhD at MIT, I think in the late 60s, when he followed executives around and he was looking at what they were doing, what was probably a much better measure of leadership practice than just asking them. So in that sense, I think it's my point 4 here is really sort of that you try to identify what the data source does well. Say an interview for me, it's great as a contextualization device. So you look at historical data, and then you get access to somebody who was actually there. Obviously, it's exciting to hear what they think about what happened, but it's often, in that context, it's a great device for sort of figuring out the types of conundrums that you have in understanding why certain things happen that you can't get from the historical data, or maybe they say something that completely surprises you that sort of don't really see. So it's a way of getting beyond the hard data. But interviews for me, they're very rarely the hard data. When they're hard data, when you're trying to, for instance, the paper that we wrote with Richard Whittington about becoming a strategist, which was about identity. So then if you're trying to figure out how people, an identity is a narrative of who we are, basically. It's sort of, it's a construction of what our life is about and what our values are about and what's our purpose. So then I think interviews are pretty good at studying identity, at least at the individual level. So that's for me, individual level identity is one of the theoretical questions that are sort of, maybe best studied by interviews. Of course, there are other sources as well. But then say strategic decision making or practice. I think those are areas that are much better, studied with other types of data than supported by interviews. I don't know, Mikko, how you would react to this, because I remember that you did in your PhD, you'd actually did a case study. So you actually have done some of this. So how do you approach this?
Yeah. Let me just note, Jeffrey Martin is with us, who did his PhD with Kathy Eisenhardt, and he makes a number of very, very important observations here. So I want to get to those in a second, but sure. but this idea of triangulation. So let me just briefly go back to Sean Joyce's dissertation defense yesterday. So as he's trying to, one of the things that he wanted to figure out was with these police officer involved shootings was the lived experience of the officers themselves. And of course, you have to interview them. But insofar as trying to find what had happened, it turns out that interviews of police officers who have just shot someone, they're incredibly unreliable sources. Because, the police officers would say that they did not even hear their own guns go off. So there's all kinds of distortions that they experience. Imagine the adrenaline rush and all that. So then what Sean did, he obviously used all kinds of other sources of data, police reports, the media. Yeah. And he said, I knew where these things happened. I mean, he had to disguise everything, but he said, I could go on Google Maps and I could actually walk the path of both the perpetrator and the police officer, and I could kind of see, so this kind of triangulation is absolutely essential. And the idea how many interviews just doesn't even begin to catch what is relevant in this. Jeffrey, you made the same comment in your postings, that this idea of triangulation. You also mentioned this idea of 6 cases ideal. Yes, in Eisenhardt 89, there is a passage that says something like X number of cases as a rule, and I think she used the word rule, tends to work well. But please read Eisenhardt 2021 Strategic Organization, where she makes very strongly the point that my method is not about the number of cases. that, whatever she wrote in the 89 piece, I don't think she meant as prescriptive in that sense. Jeffrey, I'd like to invite, would you like to maybe turn on your microphone and share some of your ideas, since you were working with Eisenhardt?
Sure, and excuse my appearance. I'm just coming out from my yard. And so I'm a
Oh,
mess.
I thought that you were on the International Space Station.
That's tomorrow. That's
Okay.
tomorrow. Yeah, what I was just typing in the chat is sometimes it comes down to a likely, these are all rules of thumb. And so it's a likely level of effort. And so it's hard to expect you could reach any sort of theoretical saturation with a level of effort that's different than what it would take to do about 80 interviews. And it takes about a day to do an interview, between scheduling it, between conducting it, between, getting it written down, coding it. You also have to hijack usually a doctoral student or a master's student as a research assistant to do the transcription. Although I haven't tried the voice to text stuff. But you could have 40 interviews, you could have a bunch of documentation, you could have the news reports. I mean, I thought the example that Mikko just gave was excellent. That if I, yeah, I made sure I had the name right, is that no one's going to have the exact same view. No data is going to have in total the exact same story. And when I referred to the cutting room floor, my own phrases, I called it, when I was doing my dissertation, the tyranny of the cutting room floor. Because there's all these cool things you see, but you only have maybe 2 things that suggest it happened. And so without at least 3 things, much like if you were interviewing a witness in a courtroom, it's hard to call something a fact, and you may believe passionately that it's a fact, but if you don't have the data, you don't have, the data. I mean, I think Mikko's example was great, and I love the variety of the data sources that he referred to that his student did. Because when I've worked off of things like press releases, maybe interviews of 2 different people, the minutes from the meeting, and if everything suggested that, Tom said this in the meeting, then I was pretty sure Tom said it. So I hope that provides enough context to do it, but you end up with a lot of stuff I call it on the cutting room floor, when you're doing all that cross-checking, and there's just a lot of things that's left there that might give you ideas for future studies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jeffrey. So going very briefly back to Sean's dissertation, his ultimate knowledge interest was he wanted to come up with policy recommendations that police departments could implement to support police officers after they have been involved in the shooting. So that knowledge interest immediately implied that interviews will be an integral part of the research project, because he needed to understand the aftermath of the shootings as lived by the police officer, what kind of support they felt they got, not just what was kind of in the protocol, but how they felt. And kind of like in the Man Gulch disaster story that Carl Weick wrote, the idea that if a firefighter drops his or her tools, what does he or she become? Same thing with police officers. When you take their gun away from them, what do they become? So this was, so the experience of your gun being taken away from you, what have you done? You've just done your job. You've just done your job. And I don't know if you knew this, but in the United States, every police officer related shooting usually ends up in the front of a grand jury. So there is an investigation. And often a jury of one's peers looking into this. Okay, very good. Saku, anything else about sample size?
Yeah, let me kind of close this off, and thanks, Jeffrey, for sharing your insight. Also, sort of, I'd like to pick up on what Ignacio, I think, said in the chat about there's a retrospective bias to interviews, which is clearly sort of, just reading the work of Carl Weick in our own field. This is, not to mention, a wealth of psychological literature on sort of, how we construct the past, how memory is actually a reconstruction rather than a sort of the notion of retention is kind of ridiculous. So memory, each act of remembering is an act of reconstruction. And we remember what we want to remember. So obviously my good colleague John Sillins, who had published some stuff, in the early 2010s, he loved reading sort of published journals of politicians, and he was always telling me about how an autobiography is not really a good source of historical information, but sort of if you actually have a, say of Churchill or sort of many of these presidents, you actually have a kind of a chronological diary that's published. It may be edited, but sort of still it's so much better in terms of sort of figuring out how things were at the time than an autobiography, which is written then, where this person, however honest they want to be, where they sort of then try to make sense of what's happened. So the sense making, changes things, and interviews are always events of sense making. And sort of, say, Jeff mentioned the kind of courtroom interview principle, which Eisenhardt already mentions in the 89 paper, which is one interview strategy. But sort of, regardless of what you do there, you're sort of, you're constructing the past with the interview. Is sometimes, to a really great effect, and sometimes you might get a very, very so-called biased account, or a very particular account, very positioned account of what happened. But I'll conclude. But I would say sort of, this goes back to the paper about making doubt generative that Martha Feldman and the two Karens, Karen Locke and Karen Goldenbiddle, published in Oak Science, a great perspectives piece, where they talk about really the value of doubt, which is, I think that they're really drawing insight from Charles Sanders Peirce's work on abduction, and turning that into a specific methodological principle for research, which I love, is that sort of we have to train ourselves to live with doubt, and sort of, to nurture doubt and make doubt work for us, and sort of, find data that makes you uncomfortable. Try to sort of really, if you want to be honest, or if you want to be sort of methodologically rigorous in the qualitative sense, don't sort of stick with in easy examples. Sort of don't just work with easy interviews. If you work with interviews, so try to find people that actually disagree with you, or sort of that might, well, you don't have, you shouldn't have an opinion, so disagree might be, but sort of people that you don't find an easy time interacting with, or that your informants wouldn't recommend. Don't, so say snowball sampling. It's a great strategy for sort of getting a particular political take on what's happening in the organization. Ask the top executives, on a snowball sample, and you're going to get the yes men and women then in the sample. So try to find data that doesn't stick, that sort of, and I guess, to use Jeff's analogy of the cutting room floor, then you're going to actually get data that really doesn't fit, that's going to be more interesting. And just not more of the same.
Yeah,
so this is how I approach the question, but there probably could be a lot of other principles.
Yeah. And I see parallels with quantitative research. Number 5, what do those who do statistical research, what do we do with uncomfortable data? We ignore it. Okay, outliers. What do we do with outliers? We throw them out because they don't fit the story. but Bill McKelvey and many others have very convincingly argued that often what is relevant and interesting is not in the tendencies of your data, but on the edges of your data. And indeed, we have methods called like data envelopment analysis and other extreme value methods that don't treat outliers and extreme values as source of discomfort, but source of fascination. But those of you who take classes in regression analysis, you are shortly after birth being told to get rid of outliers or do something to explain them away so that you can ignore them. But I think it's the same. It's a variation on theme number 5 here, very clearly. Okay, Ibrad, I'm forgetting, how much time do we have?
As long as you have time, Mikko.
As long as, okay, so in the next 6 hours, what we're going to talk about, no, just kidding. Let us shift gears a little bit. We want to go through another exercise like we just did. And this time we'll talk about how we reason about evidence. And Saku, you may want to challenge the word evidence when you speak of qualitative research, but I'll use the word evidence. And let's again start with quantitative research. So suppose, you know, as you're reading this, and if you're a quantitative researcher, you've probably faced this. I certainly have multiple times. I have derived a number of hypotheses. And when I test them with statistical analysis, I find that 3 are supported and 2 are not supported. What do we conclude? Okay, so let me walk you through this. And again, what follows is not simple, but I hope it's tractable. And this is actually, something that I include in my own doctoral seminar on research methods. So again, my students who are in the audience, you will recognize everything that I'm going to speak. I think this is stuff that needs to be taught in doctoral seminars. So what follows is based on Paul Meehl, his work. He was a largely experimental psychologist, so he wrote a piece in 1990. But this really goes back to the work of Hungarian philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, who wrote about this in his 1970 book. Okay, so as you're catching your breath, this is the logic. This encapsulates, I think, fairly accurately the logic by which we operate. So let me walk you through this. As we are deriving observational consequences, which is the stuff on the right-hand side after the arrow, as we're deriving our observational hypotheses, what do we invoke? We invoke what Lakatos called the hardcore of the theory. And let me give you as an analogy from organization economics, transaction cost economics. So the hardcore of your main theory would be the basic concepts of transaction cost economics and kind of the basic propositions. But that's, of course, not the only thing we apply. We invoke all kinds of other stuff. One is a set of auxiliary substantive theories. We make certain assumptions about economic efficiency, what the decision maker is trying to achieve, so on and so forth. We use instruments. And if you're a student of psychometrics, you know that the process of operationalization, looking at reliability and validity of measurement. So this idea that, and we speak of measurement theory, auxiliary theories regarding your instruments. We make various assumptions, ceteris paribus conditions. And then all research takes place in a context. So what Meehl called the realized conditions. I'll just call that context. Let's say you're studying the make or buy decision from a transaction cost economics perspective in the context of the automotive supply chain. So the C sub N would be then that context. And then the right-hand side is simply saying, you know, the basic logic of a hypothesis. If we observe O1, we will also observe O2. So, you know, our hypotheses are usually of this sort. And then the period is just to be read and. So anything on the left side is your hardcore theory and your auxiliary theories and ceteris paribus condition and. So, and then the arrow there, it is implication that if these 5 on the left, then it deductively follows that if we observe O1, we will also observe O2. Okay.
So perhaps
Go ahead.
So kind of the Lakatoshian idea, how I understand it in the kind of the overall context of the history of philosophy of science, is that Lakatosh is a reaction on Popper. And so
Yes.
Popper, on the other hand, was a reaction on sort of Enlightenment inductivism. So the idea that an Enlightenment inductivism was a reaction to medieval philosophy, where sort of, you started out with the assumptions about, all sorts of heavy metaphysics about sort of how God influenced reality, and you have to accept a lot of different dogmas basically to, it of course wasn't as simple as that, and there was a lot of great scholarship that was done, but still you had to kind of commit to certain assumptions. And then to get rid of those assumptions through the Enlightenment, when we really sort of, started to open up and became more empiricist, then there was this heavy, emphasis on observation, and sort of, you needed to try to work against the dogma and sort of, be surprised by what you find. And then Popper, I guess, very, very rightly came to understand that, but actually we have a lot of theory. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of theory that existed, and sort of, and we knew that the induction had certain problems. So, if you just work purely inductively, it's, and you don't make any assumptions, then sort of, your theorizing won't be very, 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 very interesting. Mm-hmm. And then sort of, but Popper, his challenge, I guess, is that he's assuming that we still have, some a-theoretical access to reality, that we can go on and test the hypotheses in isolation with everything else, and then sort of either, at least falsify it. And sort of that in itself, because we know that theory, sort of, our observation, our perception is theory laden, which is something that sort of we I think it's almost universally accepted now, at least in the psychological community, that sort of perception is really kind of, it's almost like controlled hallucination. So we're constructing a world, and then we're testing that construction against evidence. And sort of then what Lakatosh is really doing in the model is that he's kind of operating on the assumption that these research programs, they're built around a set of assumptions, the hardcore, which is protected, and then there's kind of auxiliary assumptions that can then get tested often in groups. And sort of it's a, and I guess still for me, Lakatosh is a pretty good sort of expression of mainstream philosophy of science, in particular in the natural sciences. Social sciences, of course, are a bit more tricky.
Yeah, and I
kind of read that complex logic that you have.
Yeah, and the reason I'm showing this, and the reason I'm using this in my teaching, because this helps me, and it has helped my students make sense of what we do when we go to work Monday morning. This is, so now let me walk you through two things. What do we conclude when a hypothesis is not supported and when it is supported? And let's see what kind of methodological principles we have, and then how do we work in practice? Okay, so this is sort of a simple exercise in logic, but then it's also understanding research practice and understanding what is reasonable and what's not. And the notion of reasonable is no longer a methodological notion. It really then has to do more with, well, what kinds of rules for the game do we have? Okay, so let's start with this. So suppose I'm just dividing the left-hand side, and so, if A then B, and so on and so forth. So suppose that we observe B, that this hypothesis is supported. So if A then B, that was kind of the logic of the hypothesis, and now we observe B. Are we allowed to conclude A? Well, the logician would hit us over the head and say that's a fallacy of affirming the consequent. No, you can't. But in research practice, of course, we conclude A. However, what does concluding A mean when A consists of 5 different things? And of course, the thing that's really of interest to us is T, the hardcore theory. Well, I'm putting transaction cost economics into test in the context of the automotive supply chain, and I want to see whether that theory has merit. So this is what we do as if we find statistical evidence that supports or corroborates, I believe that was Popper's term, corroborates the theory. We simply say that, okay, this means that our theory gets money in the bank. That was a term that McGill used. Does this mean that we have proven transaction cost economics? Well, certainly not in any sense of the word prove that we might think of. Have we ruled out any alternative explanations? No, we haven't even thought about them. Okay, but we are still, as matter of research practice, we are allowed to conclude that, hey, this evidence is consistent with the hardcore of the theory. Therefore, we say this corroborates the theory. And if, of course, I mean, if the hypotheses are supported, it also obviously corroborates the way we have measured things like, let's say we measured asset specificity and frequency of transacting. This also corroborates our measurement instruments and the auxiliary theories as well.
And that's, I think, it's really important, what I've learned from working with Mikko for such a long time is that really the translation of theoretical variables into empirical measures, so that's a really creative process. So, to the extent I think of like somebody like Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work. I think, his genius is really in the design of the experiments. So, in the way that he was able to come up with ways of looking at interesting things, in these elegant and simple experiments that nobody had thought about. And sort of experimental design, I would argue, it's not a deductive process, it's an abductive process. So, coming up with the variables, that's why the word hypothetical deductive, is so misleading, that we kind of assume that the hypotheses are, the measures are deduced so that there's one path, from general to the specific, which is logically sound and truth retaining, which it really isn't.
No, it isn't. I have a budding idea in my head about writing a paper on the hypothetical abductive method, because I think that's a descriptively accurate depiction of what actually happens. And indeed, the hardcore theory itself, the logic of transaction cost economics, it doesn't tell you how to measure anything. It doesn't, because it deals with theoretical concepts. So, of course, there's a massive body of knowledge, and there are a lot of transaction cost economists who are very good at turning concepts into empirical variables. But the notion of turning is everything but deduction. It actually involves creativity. It involves and essentially abductive reasoning. Now, let me close the story by suppose the hypothesis is not supported.
And this would be, I guess, close to what Popper would say falsification.
Yes, exactly. So suppose the hypothesis is not supported. Well, the principle of modus tollens, if A then B, means if not B then not A. That's not a logical fallacy. That's actually valid. You can run a couple simple exercises to confirm that to be the case. So if we observe not B, then modus tollens permits concluding not A. But what does, and this is the most important part of this example. What does concluding not A mean when A consists of 5 different things? Because not A could mean that any one of those 5, any 2 of those 5, any 3, any 4, or any 5 of those 5 on the left-hand side are incorrect.
Mm.
So the logician would tell us there's nothing else I can help you with aside from allowing you to say not A. But here is what we have in many research programs and communities this is what we have decided. We have decided that you are not allowed to go after the hardcore of the theory. If the hardcore of the theory has money in the bank, an observation that is not consistent with that theory does not immediately negate T. This is not a methodological principle. This is kind of what we think is reasonable. So, and this is what Lakatos said. Never direct modus tollens to the hardcore of the theory. Work through what he called the protective belt first, and the protective belt are the other 4 elements on the left-hand side.
So there's a auxiliary theory about an instrument, AI, which is, it could be, something of the choices of how you measure what you measure.
Precisely.
And it's enough that those are untrue, logically speaking, and then the whole of the A goes. So it doesn't mean that T is untrue. It just means that one of these is untrue. So that's what.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is logic, and I have seen this multiple times as reviewer, as author, as editor. If somebody comes back and says, hey, we have just shown that this theory doesn't apply, the first thing I look at are the measures. And if the measurement is kind of wishy-washy, or if the reliability and validity of measurement don't compel me, to me, that's the end of the conversation. I say, you know what? This is the protective belt. Your critique just got stuck in the protective belt. I'm not going to allow you to go after the hardcore of the theory. Okay. And again, this, I think, formulation, it has helped me understand how the scientific community in my own field operates, how the peer review process operates, and how these principles of how we interpret evidence, kind of what are there are a bunch of methodological rules here, to be sure, but this idea that at some point we have to decide what we will hold and treat as reasonable and unreasonable when we.
So actually, Mikko, this might be a bit of a tangent, but it makes me think of the replication crisis, the supposed replication crisis in psychology. And sort of, there are people, apparently I think it's roughly like 50% of the main experiments don't replicate. And then there are people who say that it's kind of amazing that 50% of them replicate, that we should celebrate that. And actually, so this is a pretty interesting depiction of that. That's, let's say that sort of, we would need to have 100% confidence on our measures, for instance, to expect that our core experiments would replicate. And sort of, so 50%, how we interpret that 50% is pretty neat.
Very good. Yeah. So here is a recommendation for a paper. If someone is interested in writing a methodological paper, write about the replication issue from the point of view of Lakatos's schema here. So when we say something doesn't replicate, we can obviously see dozens of reasons why that might be caused, why we don't see the same thing over and over again. Is it about the ceteris paribus conditions? Is it about the instruments? Is it about the context and so on? So there's a lot. I wouldn't use the word crisis in the context of replication, but there's certainly a lot of issues there that do merit our attention. Okay, so Saku, would you like to make some observations about reasoning about evidence in qualitative research? This is just a placeholder because we ended up putting nothing on this. So why don't you tell first the audience, why did we end up putting nothing on this slide?
Because I was undecisive on what to put in there.
Exactly.
It's so hard to come up with the same kind, the notion of theory that you're presenting, very eloquently with the Lakatos model. So it doesn't really, if you think about the type of stuff that gets published in our journals, we don't see kind of a research program operate in that way. Mm-hmm. So qualitative research isn't published in a way which would then corroborate or challenge a research program in the same way. So what it tends to do is that, say I'm thinking of just from the top of my mind, a paper by Kreiner et al. In AMJ about identity elasticity I don't know if you've read that paper, but it was a couple of years ago in AMJ. I happened to be one of the reviewers. That's why I remember that paper so well, and was happy to see it published at the end. So it's a paper which basically talks about identity change. So it talks about, we have this, by then we'd had a conversation around organizational identity that has lasted for, Albert and Wetton 85, so 2005, 2015, so it's roughly 30 years around organizational identity, which originally organizational identity came up as a concept that explains resistance to change, not in the sense of an individual, but of an organizational level resistance to a change program that seemed to make a great deal of sense, but the organization just, didn't budge. So there was something that they observed, and what they said, what they found was this construct of organizational identity, which was their explanation, is that if a change goes against a shared sense of identity, even though it would make a great deal of practical sense, it's resisted. So that was how organizational identity came about in research in organizational behavior, or sort of, or whatever. I don't even remember the journal. It's so hard to find that paper nowadays because it wasn't in one of the top journals. And then sort of there was this huge, stream of scholarship, Dutton and Dukarich, great paper in AMJ. There was a special issue in AMR 2000 on identity, and sort of they just kept coming. And sort of, Kreiner and colleagues who studied the Anglican Church came up with, came to a discourse that was pretty mature by then. So there had been a lot of stuff about sort of, organizational identity change, organizational identity formation, all sorts of things. And what they contributed in that paper was the notion of elasticity, that sort of, that organizational identity has this quality of being able to absorb shocks to the system by sort of shifting, and sort of sometimes it's more rigid and sometimes it's more malleable depending on the situation, that allows the organization to survive. So what is that as a contribution? So that's for me it's a Joop Cornelissen, our good friend, would say that that's an example of what he would call frame blending, the blending of two concepts, the analogy of elasticity from I think it's material physics, I suppose, or some form of physics, which says something about matter, how it responds to external influences, and identity, which is originally an individual psychological metaphor that's then used as an analogy for something in the organization. And then it's blending of those two to say something specific of identity, but sort of how, and they're using interviews and all sorts of evidence from longitudinal, really good set of data, which is triangulated. But sort of, is it, so what is it doing? So is it's somehow, it's certainly not attempting to confirm or disconfirm something in theory. It's kind of adding to the theory. I would say a pretty classical example of theory elaboration by conceptual innovation. So it's adding maybe it's an auxiliary concept. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. But sort of, and you said that you wanted me to push back or explore the concept of evidence. So evidence is something that's related to judgment, in the courtroom, but perhaps we use it more broadly as well. That for me, this is evidence that this has happened, even if I'm not a judge in the courtroom. So is that appropriate for qualitative inquiry? I don't think that concept necessarily. Well, it depends. If your task is really to interpret, so you're going to have the Joanne Martin example from organization science. So perhaps we should think about evidence against that. So is data there evidence of anything? Probably not.
Okay, so let's introduce that. So on the next slide, we're going to show Joanne Martin's entire data set. Is going to be on one slide. It's about 5 lines of text. It is an excerpt from a speech of a CEO who is talking about a product launch. and how a very central individual to that product launch is someone, is a female employee who is pregnant and who is about to give birth. So I'm going to show you the next slide. You will be reading Joanne Martin's, and this is in Org Science, okay? You will be reading her entire data set. So I'll let you read that, and then I would like to invite Saku to comment on in what ways is that a data set? In what sense is that evidence? And how can you write 20 pages of text and analysis based on 5 lines of CEO speech? Okay, so now that I've set it up, here is the text. We'll give you about 15 seconds to read through it, and then I'll invite Saku to comment. Drum roll, please. Here we go. Saku?
Yeah, so this is basically I think, yeah, so this is the first volume of organizational science.
Yes.
This is, the journal was very, very young. Joanne Martin is professor emeritus at Stanford. Wonderful scholar of organizational culture. Her book Cultures in Organizations is one of my favorites in our field, sort of favorite monographs. And then, but this is a paper really, so this is the data set for the whole paper.
Yes.
She is using the method of deconstruction that comes from French philosopher Jacques Derrida. And sort of, it is this is the most methodologically radical paper that I know of in the so-called A-journal circuit. So for instance, Martin Kilduff has published something in the AMR where he's reading March and Simon. So he's, the whole book is then what he's deconstructing. We have a paper called Voicing Seduction to Silence Leadership, which was published around the same time, early 90s, by Marta Kallas and Linda Smerkich in organization studies, where actually my good colleague Henry Mintzberg's book on leadership was one of the targets of deconstruction. There's a hilarious response from Henry, because the other one was Chester Barnard, and sort of they're looking for sexualized meaning in these leadership texts. But here, this is really sort of, and in both these cases, it's a much wider data set. So at least, entire book or set of books, this is just this one paragraph of real life transcribed speech. You can see how the grammar isn't there, because this is how people actually speak. But what is this, is this evidence of something? I doubt that this is evidence in the same sense that we, because and the paper, I often use this paper in my PhD seminars, and sort of, typically, normally it's a man for some reason, who blows their top about sort of, how unreasonable it is to do what Martin is doing for this poor CEO who was intending whatever. So clearly you cannot use anything like this to prove anything. Mm-hmm. But what she's doing, sort of Jacques Derrida himself, and his work has obviously been very contentious. He, when they tried to give him a honorary doctorate at was it Oxford or Cambridge? I think Oxford. There was a huge public uproar and sort of protests on campus that this man is a charlatan, and sort of we shouldn't be tainting our reputation by doing this. So obviously we can sort of debate the method. He does, for instance, work on postcards. So he uses his postcards to draw conclusions of Western culture or whatever. But here, what Martin does, for instance, she's looking at the gendered use of language, the assumption. For instance, she starts with the the phrase "we have a young woman," we have a young woman. So having a woman, she makes quite a bit about that. Sort of, tries to somehow demonstrate how kind they are to this young woman, and trying to facilitate her work-life balance by arranging all of this. So you should read it. And for instance, actually, she talks about cesarean. The word of goes back to Caesar. What belongs to Caesar. So she does some pretty wild stuff here in the paper. Some of which is, I think, it's attributable to the fact that it was the first volume of Organization Science, and they were really trying to be radical at that point. So I think probably this paper wouldn't have slipped through. Otherwise, I think just the acceptance for this type of work in the A journals normally isn't there, I found. But what it's a great example of is radical interpretation. So she's not claiming that this goes back to the notion of a theoretical saturation. There's nothing that theoretical saturation can do here as a concept for us, because she's not trying to saturate the data set in any way. She's trying, this is linked with an epistemological position which is radically constructivist. So she's interpreting, and when you go back to the idea of interpretation, the hermeneutic circle, it doesn't sort of hone in on a specific point. So it's not closing in on something, it's opening up. So this is what the hermeneutic circle does. There's new interpretation, new possibilities that emerge out of it, and then obviously sort of we can end up having these normal debates about whether or not that's scientific research or whether we accept that as scientific knowledge. And if you want to do that, you can join the club. So that club has been ongoing for quite some time now. And it brings in politics, so it opens up that whole kind of worm. So research policy is basically this paper is a feminist paper, so it's an openly feminist paper. All of this is entirely.
Can I make?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me make an observation, because when one of the things she does in this article, she reconstructs the same passage by inserting a man. Well, man is not going to have a C-section, but she says, okay, let's say open heart surgery. Mm-hmm. And so we have a young man who is blah, blah, blah. He has arranged to have his open heart surgery yesterday to prepare for this. As I read that reconstruction, I made the conclusion this paper is not about gender conflict. It's about what is public and what is private. That's what I got out of it. So I even asked myself, why is the word gender conflict in the title? Because I think there is a more general theme that is about, kind of intrusion into the private life. I mean, if I were this man with this heart problem and I read this passage of text, I would probably want to vomit. And I certainly wouldn't. I would not be attending through closed circuit television right after my heart surgery so I can be attending a work-related event. It just sounds disgusting, but it has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with what is private and what is public. And I think somebody made a comment in the, I think it was Nasrin. Yeah, you wrote that it could be a paper on, and then it's organizational culture, contribution of employees in organizations, family work balance, adaptability, employee support. Yeah, so we can read different kinds of themes into this. And this really turns you, the reader, the audience, into an active participant, I think, in the knowledge creation process.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which doesn't happen so much with quantitative work. And
I'll just... Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's entirely, again, consistent with the sort of philosophical tradition. So when I said that this is one of the points where epistemology and methodology intersect, so around the question of saturation. So it is entirely consistent with, say, Gadamerian hermeneutics, that sort of, each and every reading of the text is always a generative event. Mm-hmm. So, as also sort of, she's not only giving her, the interpretation doesn't stop there. So your interpretation is already another interpretation that is, is entirely consistent with the idea. What the paper does is that it kind of provide, and I guess many of the great, say, ethnographies, even though they weren't necessarily done in a radical interpretivist sense, but say, Clifford Geertz's piece on Balinese cockfighting or the street corner society, these thick descriptions, which sort of, are intended to sort of, bring the reader into a context. They actually do something, for me, they do something a bit similar. That sort of, the point is that each reader encounters the data and draws. So it's not that the researcher draws and concluded interpretation of what it was about.
Exactly.
But there's this open-endedness. Oh, for England to Saussure coming in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm not a big Saussure expert, so or structuralism, but that sounds interesting. But yeah, so just to be kind of clear here, that's why I didn't have a lot of stuff about evidence for qualitative research, because it really depends on what you want to do. And there's, that's, and arguably, I think one of the points that stick about this critique of what's called templates, even though I think much of that critique is actually pretty one-sided and unfair, but sort of, one worry that underpins it is that truly qualitative research, one of its strengths is that it sort of tends to introduce plurality into the field. So it really reinvigorates the field by sort of really kind of constantly coming up with these weird new approaches that are in idiosyncratic and sort of then challenge us to think differently. Martin is clearly one example of a person who's done that throughout her career. So there's a lot of other work as well.
So Mariska, you wrote that the language here suggests gender-based possession. I fully agree. But also, it's not only about what the text says, but also what it could say. And I think that's where the reconstruction idea becomes relevant, that there are really multiple, I don't want to say multiple layers, but multiple ways of reading this. So certainly there is, and I think she said, Joan Martin says openly in the article that, I'm an open feminist. So, I mean, she discloses that. But when I read the article, I said, there's much more. There are more messages here more important messages than just the idea of gender conflict that we could glean from this in terms of understanding. And that's where the reconstruction really helped me kind of see the multiple interpretations that one could give to this. But certainly the idea of gender-based possession is very, very clear here as well. So I'm not discounting that, obviously, in any way. Okay.
So I hope the idea, I think, which is really important, is that what you want the research to do. I think a thought experiment here would be that, how do you design an Eisenhardt style study around the same topic? Where you're assuming that you need to sort of have constant comparison between different cases, and you need to be able to generalize and come up with propositions. Then the data set obviously would be very, very different. Joan Martin is in the same universities than Kathy Eisenhardt is, and sort of, this is, the type of a context that both of them study, something that happens in California, around San Francisco. I think this was where the speech was given, but still sort of, probably would see a lot more data. It would see comparison between cases, and sort of then you would see a very different type of an outcome of the study. So then, and there you wouldn't have the assumption that the reader interpreting your data in a different way than you do would be a strength of the study. But that's the epistemological, bind here. And the also methodological implication from epistemological constructivism is that sort of if each and every interpreter has their own construction of what we're seeing, then we're not supposed to sort of kill off that diversity. We're not supposed to sort of have a cutting room floor as Jeff said, but we're supposed to open up an interpretation that's generative of further interpretation.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So winding down here, we have just one more slide here. Just a couple takeaways just to sum this up, and then we'll thank you for your participation. So just 5 things we want to leave you with. If we think of reasoning from the point of view of using our cognitive machinery, mimicking others is easy. Seeking guidance is easy. Figuring things out yourself, which means reasoning, is hard and it's frustrating. It's really frustrating at times just to think of simple things like seemingly simple things like sample size. I mean, they can really, be frustrating. But then the second point is, so insofar as your academic career is concerned, mimicry is becoming increasingly risky. Saying that I followed Eisenhardt, I followed Joya, it's becoming a risky strategy. Explicit reasoning, I wouldn't even suggest it as a strategy. I'm just going to flat out say that it's increasingly expected. I certainly, as a reviewer and as an editor and as a dissertation thesis advisor, I expect explicit reasoning. If I don't see it, I'll send you back to your room and you come back when you are ready to show explicit reasoning. And this idea of seeking guidance and prescription without attention to nuance, it's kind of like seeking treatment without diagnosis, which probably isn't a good idea. Now, point number 4, and I mentioned this already briefly, these templates, there's been a lot of discussion and writings on templates. There's going to be a really interesting issue coming out in Journal of Management Inquiry, led by Denny Joya. And it's going to be a reaction to the 2019, it just came out in Org Research Methods, a critical evaluation of templates. Please read the ORM special issue, and then when Denny Joya's piece comes out, read that. It'll be fun. I seen a draft of Denny's response, and let's say it's colorful. Okay, and also please read Kathy Eisenhardt's 21 article in Strategic Organization. If you think that her 89 method is something that she wanted you to follow, and if 6 cases is what you should have in a multiple case study. And then finally, Saku and I have a manuscript under review where we look at these templates, reasoning templates, not so much from the point of view of guidance, but questioning, kind of the Socratic idea, dialogue instead of giving answers, asking questions. So that's under preparation, and hopefully we'll see the light of day one day. Saku, any last words to our audience?
Any famous last words, like my tulips that have been eaten by the squirrels during the night? I have a bunch of headless tulips in my garden. Last words. I think Denny Joya's story in particular, I think is really interesting because I've been following it. I was even sort of in one of my papers in AMJ was used as an exemplar in Joya's ORM on what is the Joya method? Is there such a thing? And it's a Joya methodology rather than a method. So I've certainly sort of used his work as an exemplar on how I've structured my qualitative work. But also I've seen this hesitancy on his part. Sort of he's really uncomfortable with people sort of mimicking him or aping the way that he does stuff. So I think he's proud of what he's, and I think it is genuinely impressive what he's pioneered in the way that he's able to it's one way of solving the problem between data and theory, but then sort of demonstrating how your concepts link with your data. But sort of I think he was asked, I think, for years to have a plenary at the academy to talk about, and I think ultimately they arranged it without him, and then he showed up because he was so uncomfortable. And sort of he long before this, he said that the notion of people using my work as a template gives me the willies, that it just doesn't, I'm uncomfortable with it. So it's interesting that it's it's one thing to have a craft and a kind of a signature approach that you pioneered and then promote that. I think Eisenhardt is somewhat different because she did publish the paper in 89, which is the high, she did present it as a method for people to use in different ways. So I think but I guess one thing is that also, templates, they can be highly generative. They can help us, understand each other. They can manage the at least the cognitive cost of what we're doing if they're used as tools. And also there's like, Anne Langley's work is a good example of kind of tools that really open up, that are Socratic in nature, that they point towards questions that then challenge and nurture this responsibility and doubt in us.
Yeah. And I would invite each of you to read again Gioia and Eisenhardt, and choose to read them not from the point of view of guidance, but of questioning. I think they would fully, both Gioia and Eisenhardt, I'm pretty sure they would endorse the idea that, hey, don't take it as guidance, but take it as a, food for thought. What kinds of questions do you find asking as you're doing this? I do want to, let's see, I think Michelle wrote something really important. I feel uncomfortable with how our students feel pressured to mimic. I've seen that. I have seen that as I've served on dissertation committees. I have seen that in presentations at the Academy and others, that there is this pressure to mimic. And I don't know where it comes from, but sure as hell doesn't come from me. And I would hope that faculty look in the mirror and reflect on this and say, have we built a community where doctoral students who come in somehow get the idea that their task is to follow rules? Because if that's what's happened, then I think we have failed. So this notion of mimicry, it really, if it gives Denny the willies, it gives me the heebie-jeebies. And Denny Gioia isn't just concerned; he's infuriated. Read the upcoming JMI article. He's not just concerned; he's pissed off. He's pissed off.
Yeah, especially she really kind of hit the spots. Yeah, it's funny. Bring out the popcorn. Sometimes we can enjoy ourselves also and be entertained in this.
There you